So Michelle High, Managing Editor, American Purpose, thank you very much. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. We're going to run a little bit less than 60 minutes to allow our guest of honor to get on to his class here in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Hal Brands. Great to see you. Stanford alumnus, SAIS, and American Enterprise Institute distinguished writer, historian, strategist who has produced, I can tell you, a fabulous book. Its title is Twilight Struggle, and it's what the Cold War can teach us about great power rivalry today. I'm sorry to all of you that I can't hold the book up. I bought it on Amazon and read it on Kindle, but I can tell you it's a fabulous read. It's timely, it's substantive, and it is a fabulous read also in that, as I heard a distinguished editor once say, good prose should be like glass, crystal, clear, and that's the way Hal Brands thinks, and that's the way Hal Brands writes. I must add of pride that Hal is also a contributing editor with American Purpose. We're going to start with me asking three, maybe 3.5 questions for our guest of honor. Then we're going to open up to the gallery because the group is distinguished with tremendous experience. Hal, thank you, first of all. Congratulations on the book and welcome.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. It's great to be here with everybody. And the mention that I have to go teach class after this is accurate, and probably brought back bad acid flashbacks for Ted, who I see up here on the screen, who was one of my victims at Duke. But it's great to see you again, Ted. And it's great to see everybody else here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. And Ted and everybody, welcome. How, first of all, I'm going to start with basics, including for those who haven't read the book yet. You talk about how great power rivalry is not an exception. It's not new. You dive right into Russia and China. Could you give us a little bit of historical perspective on why this book and why now? And I know we're going to get into Ukraine and some of the Indo-Pacific issues, but scene set for us a little bit about why this book, why now, and how you want us to understand great power rivalry with two distinct entities, Russia and China today.
Sure. So I guess the way I would start by answering that question is with the point that you made, which is that great power rivalry is essentially normal. And we could be forgiven for forgetting that after 25 or 30 years in which the international system was characterized by a relatively low level of international competition between great powers, in part because for a significant part of that time, there weren't any, truly great powers other than the United States. And so I think if you are of a certain age, and so, I was born in 1983, I've never known anything but a situation in which great power competition was really most notable by its absence. That started to change, obviously, and people come to different conclusions on when that started to change. Some might say it started to change with the 2008 financial crisis. Some might say it was sort of the 2013, 2014 time period. Some might say it was 2015 or 2016, but it was becoming increasingly clear to me and to a lot of other people by the time I started working on this book, which I guess would have been in 2019, that we were entering or re-entering a period in which the United States was going to be dealing with sustained, potentially relatively intense and dangerous rivalries, not just with one competitor, but with two. And I think the question of whether Russia deserved to be mentioned in the same breath with China was probably more of a live question back in 2018, 2019, when I started working on the book than it is today for obvious reasons. But nonetheless, what I was responding to was a sense that great power competition was something, it was new, it was novel, it was unfamiliar to us. And I think all those things were true in a sense, but it just kind of distracted us from the fact that the period we had been living in was the historical aberration rather than the norm. And so we should be able to learn quite a lot from looking at previous instances of great power competition in terms of thinking about the dynamics of that sort of phenomenon and the challenges it would pose for us. And we can learn a lot in particular from looking at the last, and maybe, depending on how you count, the only instance of this in American history. The Cold War is really, I would say, the only time in America's history in which the United States has geared up deliberately over a sustained period of time lasting multiple decades to compete with an authoritarian rival. You could maybe make that argument about US-UK rivalry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, although I think that's probably more of a stretch. And so if we want to know what the United States does well in great power rivalry, what it does poorly, what it takes for us to succeed, we can do better. We can do worse than looking at this period. And then the last reason that I was sort of motivated to do the book is that for most people in positions of responsibility, the Cold War is something that happened within living memory. And so Joe Biden has a certain understanding of the Cold War that I'm sure shapes his decision-making vis-a-vis China and Russia. And so what I wanted to avoid was a situation in which we use the Cold War reflexively because it's the thing that we remember, but we do so superficially without really understanding the nature of that rivalry and what it took to succeed. And so the book is really an attempt to look forward by looking backward, to go back to this previous period of great power rivalry and see what it can teach us about today.
So Hal, thank you. You've touched on part of my next question. You stress in the book that if we're looking at this period and what history can help us with, that these are often long-term struggles, that these are often protracted rivalries, and yet by instinct and by zeitgeist, we're given to snapshots. It's the pull, or maybe it's the push. How do you help us think as a historian and strategist where we're pushed to take snapshots, reach conclusions, but as you say, we need to think longer term, and as you say in the book, about our relative strengths, weaknesses, and liabilities. That requires, I think, vision and a tremendous amount of patience and persistence.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think the methodological point that it brings up is that our understanding of the Cold War and the lessons it teaches would be very different if we were running this exercise in 1952 or 1968 or even 1983, right? It's really only once the Cold War ends that we have a sense, I think, of what the lessons really are. And I'll give you a concrete example of this because that's kind of an abstract way of putting it. We look back now on containment as this brilliant strategy that carried the United States through the Cold War successfully and helped us, navigate between the extremes of appeasement and escalation and helped us get everything that we wanted in the end. At least I think that's how people who think the Cold War worked well would characterize it. And to a certain extent, that's true, but that is very much a retrospective view of containment. I mean, containment was one of these strategies that didn't seem particularly attractive in real time. It was slow, it was plodding, it was frustrating, it was hard to tell whether you were getting closer to success or not. There were lots of times during the Cold War when it looked like the balance of power might be tipping in unfavorable directions. It was one of these strategies that even kind of looked like it was, often failing up until the time when it succeeded beyond almost everybody's wildest imagination. And as a result of that, containment was a strategy that was, I would say, more often critiqued than praised during the Cold War. It got hit even just in the late 1940s from the right? And so from old isolationists like Robert Taft, who basically said that we're leading ourselves to woe with all of these new commitments, was opposed to NATO, was opposed to the permanent stationing of US troops in Western Europe, but also from the left, and not just from the Henry Wallace left, but from the Walter Lippmann left. And of course, the term Cold War is something that was popularized in the United States by Walter Lippmann in a book that he wrote critiquing the concept of containment in response to George Kennan's X article in 1947. And so this has been sort of a long digression, but I think it serves an important point, which is that knowing which lessons to emphasize and which ones to discard or which conclusions to discard becomes a lot easier once we know how the struggle turns out. And in some ways, that's why looking at the Cold War is so important, because we obviously are at a relatively early stage of the US-China and US-Russia rivalries, it's hard to draw lessons from the first 2, 3, 5 years of those rivalries. So I think that actually places a higher premium on going back to the past and seeing what the Cold War may be able to teach us.
So Hal, my last question before we open it up, in the book you note, and as I recall fairly early on, that in both cases, China and Russia, after the end of the Cold War, we tried to integrate and we sought the idea of responsible stakeholders, and we failed, or we certainly weren't very successful in either case. Could you talk to us a little bit about why that's the case in this recent history, the last 3 decades? And the parentheses to that is, if I may, because you talk about this in the book, 9/11. After 9/11, did we take our eye off the ball? Did we allocate resources and political capital in a way that was excessive or unhelpful?
So that's a big question, and just by way of recapitulating some of the arguments I make in the book, I mean, I think that the U.S. had a coherent theory of success vis-a-vis Russia and particularly China after the end of the Cold War, which is probably pretty familiar to most people by now, which is that you would draw China into the existing international order by emphasizing the economic benefits of integration, while also dissuading China from challenging the order by maintaining alliances and relatively robust military capabilities in the Western Pacific, so that whenever Chinese leaders were confronted with kind of the cost-benefit calculus of antagonizing the United States or disrupting the balance of power in East Asia, they would calculate that it wasn't worth it, that their lives were better off integrating into the system than challenging it. And this was kind of the sneakily subversive part of it, that over time, that would affect the balance of political forces within China, that as China became richer and a middle class emerged, that middle class would not be satisfied with extremely limited political rights accorded to it by the CCP, would push for change, and you would get an emergence of some sort of more inclusive, more humane regime than currently exists. And the mechanism of that was always left unclear, but this was something that was, actively vocalized by American leaders. And so I think that, what we kind of got wrong was a few things. And I should also say, by the way, I don't think this was a foolish or a stupid policy to have pursued. It's kind of hard for me to imagine that we would have taken the Mearsheimer line of actively suppressing China's growth as soon as the Cold War ended. That would have been difficult to do, just on humanitarian grounds. I think it would have been difficult to get allies on our side and doing it. It would have been difficult strategically. But I do think that there were a couple of problems sort of built into this policy. And so one was that we never quite appreciated how threatening that policy looked from the perspective, not necessarily of China, but of the Chinese Communist Party. And so the CCP could see very well where this chain of events was meant to end, which was in the weakening or collapse of their political power. And unsurprisingly, they didn't have a whole lot of interest in that. And so the CCP basically pursued its own relatively smart strategy of using the fruits of integration into the international economy to develop a degree of performance-based legitimacy with the population, buying off dissent, and also investing in their own repressive capabilities as a way of sort of holding on to power more tenaciously than we thought. I think the second problem was that we probably overestimated the effect, the degree to which a country like China would ever be content accepting kind of second-tier status in an American-led international order. Again, this is a place where a long view of history can be useful. There wasn't a lot in the long run of China's history to make you think that that was a winning proposition. There's a great book by a journalist named Michael Sherman called Superpower Interrupted, which makes the point that for most of recorded history, China has viewed itself as a superpower, if not the superpower, to use an anachronistic term, and has tried to sort of array the international system around it. And so there's a powerful historical impetus to the policies that China and Xi Jinping are pursuing today. And so it's not entirely surprising that as China's power grew and it became more capable of challenging the international system, it became more willing to do so. And I think this relates to a third factor, and then I promise I'll talk about 9/11, which is just the shifting balance of power. And so the combination of engagement and hedging worked really well in the mid-1990s when U.S. Strengths were so pronounced that there was simply no percentage in China frontally challenging the U.S.-led international order. And a good example of this in the 1995-96 Taiwan crisis, the Beijing realizes there's nothing it can do to overcome U.S. military power in the Western Pacific. It worked less well as the balance of power shifted over time, as China took the fruits of this economic boom and plowed them into a military buildup that's dramatically changed the balance of forces in the Western Pacific. And so it was, I think, to some degree inevitable that as China's strength grew, its willingness to challenge the system would grow as well. And then I think this brings me to the final point, which is the one that you asked about specifically, Jeff, which is the question of American distraction. And I think this one is a little bit trickier than is sometimes made out, and perhaps a little bit trickier than I make it out to be in the book, in the sense that I don't know that, even absent U.S. intervention in the Middle East after 9/11, the United States would have done dramatically more in, say, the 2001 to 2008 period to position itself to deal with China's rise. But it certainly did drain away resources. It drained away political will. It empowered much farther reaching critiques of American foreign policy, all of which left the United States less well positioned to deal with the emergence of the Chinese challenge that came about, particularly in kind of let's say the 2011 to 2018 time period or something like that. And the fact that the post 9/11 wars dragged on much longer than anybody envisioned at the time, I think had a compounding effect on that. So when you put these four factors together, I think it kind of helps explain why our theory of success vis-a-vis China in particular didn't bear fruit.
So Hal, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, the floor is open. We have 30 minutes and change for your questions and comments. Press the button, raised hand, or wave through the screen. If I miss you, Michelle is good at flagging for me. Who would like to be first? Larry, please. And in each case, if you would introduce yourself, everybody knows everybody almost, but nevertheless.
Hi, thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Hal. I'm Larry Haas. I'm a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council and columnist and author on foreign policy. Hal, with regard, since you're talking about what great power rivalry can teach us about the future, I do want to ask you something about the future related to Russia-Ukraine. To what extent do you believe that Americans are getting a useful tutorial on the value of the liberal order, American leadership, the real threats to freedom and democracy from overseas, and just how small of a world we live in these days, whether the generation that I'm talking about is pre or post 1989? I know that's a very big question, but in the horror of Russia-Ukraine, I just sort of wonder whether this is a silver lining that perhaps will help us come together a little bit more as a people, and at least on the question of what is our role in the world, both for the world and for ourselves.
I think it's a great question. And in fact, to engage in a little bit of shameless self-promotion, I have a piece out with a co-author, Michael Beckley, in Foreign Affairs Today, trying to answer that question. And I think the argument the answer we give is yes, essentially, that certainly this crisis has had the effect of producing, almost an overnight revolution in European strategic thought. And I think the argument has often been made in recent years that in some ways, the European countries are the primary beneficiaries of the existing international order, which came about and sort of solved the problem that Europe had faced for decades before, which was that it couldn't balance its own affairs, and had become so complacent in that environment that many of them were unwilling or couldn't see the need to invest seriously in the maintenance of that order. And I think, Germany was exhibit A when you would hear that critique made. And there have been remarkable changes in the last 2 weeks, whether it's, commitments to dramatically enhanced defense spending, relaxations on longstanding bans on arms exports. I think, renewed appreciation for the importance of NATO and the relationship with the United States. The number one person who's responsible for whatever revitalization NATO has enjoyed now and over the past 8 years, of course, is Vladimir Putin, who has had the effect of reminding people of why this alliance exists in the first place. And I think you can see at least the possibility of a similar lesson being taken in the United States. And so I observe this a little bit in dealing with my students, and not so much the graduate students, but the undergrads in particular, who I think, if you were born in, pardon me, 2000 or 2001 or 2002, you probably haven't thought of us as living through a golden age of U.S. foreign policy over the past 22 years. And when people talk about the international order, it's in an incredibly abstract way that doesn't always connect. And I think people are getting a very tangible illustration of what the international order is and why it's important right now, because it exists to prevent things like this from happening. And so I'm seeing sort of shifts in views on foreign policy in real time among young people that I interact with today. And in some ways, the Cold War parallel here might be the Korean War. And so not in the sense that there's differences. The U.S. gets directly involved very quickly in the Korean War, not the case in Ukraine, and you can go down the list of differences. But in both cases, in the late 1940s, the United States had articulated a strategy of containment without appropriating anything near the level of resources necessary to make that a reality, to mount a credible defense of Western Europe, for instance. And the Korean War changes it by convincing people that the threat of global conflict is actually very real, and opening the door to investments and policy initiatives, rearming West Germany, for instance, that had been considered unthinkable before. You can imagine a similar shift now. I mean, we've had 2 consecutive presidential administrations that have sort of declared great power competition on China and Russia, but we're still very much living in an era of kind of post-Cold War levels of urgency and investment. And so it's possible, depending on what the Biden administration does, that you could see this conflict play a similar role in sort of turbocharging American strategy that the Korean War played. Now, we got to be careful, right? Because the Korean War also led to some pretty negative consequences, whether it's the escalation of the war in Korea, which backfires disastrously when the Chinese come in, or the extent to which Korea convinced us that we had to oppose communist gains almost literally everywhere. And that eventually leads us to grief as well. So there are positive and negative lessons that we try to highlight. But I do think that there is, my hope is that the current crisis will have a similarly galvanizing effect.
So, colleagues, let's go to Ted and then Todd Greentree. Ted, you have the floor, and please introduce yourself.
Nice to see everybody. My name is Ted Lenhart. I'm a lawyer in New York, and incidentally, as Professor Brands very kindly mentioned in his introduction, a former student and thesis advisee at Duke. And Professor Brands, it's great to be your student again this morning. And after enduring my questions for many years back at Duke, you're very kind again to tolerate another one today. In considering containment, policymakers often focus on the success of NATO. And of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has only highlighted that history in recent weeks. Less well studied are, of course, the less successful Cold War alliances in other regions, like SEATO in Southeast Asia and the Northern Tier in the Middle East. What can the United States learn from those relative failures in building what we hope will be more successful new partnerships like the Quad or other bilateral or alliance structures in East Asia?
That's a great question. And Ted mentioned his honors thesis, which actually looked at an aspect of this, which was the U.S. effort to kind of set up CENTO in the early 1950s and why it came to grief and why the United States ended up intervening in Iran. And for anybody who's looking for a very sophisticated dissection of that particular decision, you really can't find a better piece of work than Ted's. But I think the lessons are fairly straightforward, and I actually think we've learned those lessons, or at least we're operating in a way that makes me think we have learned those lessons today. And so the problem with both CETO and CENTO was kind of twofold. And so one was that, or I guess maybe threefold. One was that the countries that were involved in many cases did not bring a whole lot of useful capability. They brought more problems than they brought solutions to the alliance. It wasn't necessarily their fault, right? It was simply, in many cases, they were, if you're talking about CETO, there were newly independent states. There were countries that were still sort of trying to find their way, dealing with imperial legacies and that sort of thing. So that was one problem. The second problem was that the alliances weren't actually that well suited to the problems that were, posed in these regions. And so, CETO was meant to be a deterrent to kind of conventional aggression. It didn't deter very well the sort of insurgency that South Vietnam started facing in the late 1950s and after. And then the third, I think lesson was that we shouldn't want it more than the other members of the alliance want it for themselves, right? And this was one of the things that made NATO work so well, is that it actually wasn't an American idea, right? It was a European idea. You had European countries that were desperate for protection and had concluded that the United States was the only country that could break the cycle of conflict in Europe while at the same time offering a degree of protection from the Soviet Union. And that factor was not present in either of the other cases. And so those kind of suggest, I think, what the lessons are. And I think that the good news is that American policymakers, I think, understand these things. And so if you look at the Indo-Pacific today, I think the United States has basically said, we're going to take an aggressive approach to signing up new security partners. And we will, work with countries however they want to work with us to address, malign Chinese influence and so on and so forth. But we're taking actually a very tightly scoped approach to expanding U.S. alliances or adding new alliance partners. And of course, you can see this most closely when it comes to Taiwan. The Biden administration, I think, has been pretty forward-leaning in the sense that it would not simply sit by and see Taiwan conquered by China, but actually has refused so far to even go as far as, moving from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity. And so, there's not a whole lot of talk about creating an Asian NATO. People understand that the Quad isn't going to play that role. It can play a useful role, but it's going to be in a different way. And so, I think the lessons are, don't apply a one size fits all template to working with allies and partners. Different allies and partners are going to bring different things to the table. Two, sort of think creatively about the sort of partnerships that you can enlist and use sort of varying ways of doing that. But I think the third point is a little bit more complex, and it is that there are times when the United States is going to need to push allies and partners to do things that they are not quite comfortable with yet, right? And so it would be great if their threat perceptions and our threat perceptions aligned totally. And so at precisely the moment when we started thinking about deploying intermediate range conventional missiles in Asia, all the Asian allies said they wanted those things as well. That's often not the case. And so alliance management is going to continue to involve a degree of sort of letting them come to us and hopefully having them push us in certain areas, while also sometimes pushing them to take steps they may not be entirely comfortable with. And there's a Cold War parallel there, which of course was German rearmament.
So, gentlemen, thank you. Michelle, my colleague, has put into chat Ted's article for us on U.S.-Chinese competition. Please have a look at that. We're going to go now to Todd and then to Fritz. Todd, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, hi, Todd Greene, former Foreign Service Officer, currently with the Oxford Changing Character of War program. And following up on this idea that Ukraine, of course, and the reversal of all these assumptions that were supposedly permanent that have suddenly become reversed. One of the things that struck me is that the term endless wars has disappeared as an epithet from the lexicon. And everybody, and by everybody I mean institutions, leaders, are embracing this notion of open-ended war to impose costs on Russia or whatever, with a willing and enthusiastic Ukrainian nation that's mobilized to resist and bear the costs that it may be on them. So the obvious Cold War parallel was support for anti-Soviet resistance movements, and not just Afghanistan, but elsewhere. And in my career, I served in El Salvador, Angola, and Afghanistan between 1980 and 2012. So thinking of the difference, Ukraine at the center of geopolitics rather than the periphery. What's your take on lessons about long wars and their aftermaths?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I mean, I'll just offer a few thoughts. And so one is that I think in some ways the Afghanistan parallel is apt in the sense that the Russians have replicated some of the mistakes that the Soviets made in Afghanistan. You know, in Afghanistan, the Soviets didn't plan on staying there for a decade, right? They planned on changing the government there, propping it up, and then getting out relatively shortly. And they found that that was not possible in the same way that I think that's not going to be possible for Putin. And so it's, you know, the Russians may be able to achieve some of their near-term military objectives simply by applying brute force, although I think even that is an open question at this point. I find it very hard to see how they can achieve the political objectives that Putin postulated at sort of the beginning of the conflict, which basically involved the destruction of Ukraine as an independent entity. And even if the Russians are able to, severely reduce the combat effectiveness of the Ukrainian forces, I think they'll face an insurgency. I think they'll face ongoing resistance. And I don't think any pro-Russian government that is left behind in Kyiv is going to survive very long once Russian troops leave. And so in that sense, there is an opportunity for the West to impose some pretty significant costs on the Russian military, potentially on the Russian regime, by finding ways of keeping Ukrainian resistance going. A second point we should understand, though, is that, like, let's not kid ourselves about what that means, right? And so, you know, it's all well and good to talk about a Ukrainian insurgency. That's going to be an incredibly bloody and sort of dreary affair for the Ukrainians who are doing the fighting. That's thing one. And thing two is that it won't be without risk of escalation involving the United States. And so, look, weapons and supplies have to get to Ukraine from somewhere, right? It's probably going to be coming across the border from one of the NATO states that Ukraine abuts, Poland, Romania, something like that. And we also know that insurgencies have a much higher prospect of success if they can establish sanctuaries where they are not subject to continual military pressure. And so I would imagine that part of this would involve some sort of footprint of the Ukrainian insurgency on the NATO side of the line. Now, the Russians understand that if they allow that to continue, it's going to severely prejudice their prospects for success in Ukraine. And so we're already seeing Russian sort of ambiguous threats about hitting supplies that are coming in from the West, destined for the Ukrainian military. They've made sort of a less ambiguous demonstration of that ability with the attack on the staging area in Western Ukraine. I guess it was yesterday morning, our time. And so you're going to see sort of a contest and coercion between the two sides where there is a meaningful risk of escalation. And because you mentioned Afghanistan in particular, you know, the Red Army did occasionally come across the border into Pakistan during the 1980s, conducting airstrikes, otherwise trying to disrupt the sanctuaries that the Afghan resistance fighters were using. And so it's a mistake to think that sort of we all had a principled agreement that we would get to supply weapons that would kill Soviet soldiers and the Soviets wouldn't do anything about it. It was sort of an ongoing contest and pressure and counter pressure over time. And so if we are thinking about this in a cost imposition context, which I think makes sense, we also need to be attuned to all the ways in which this is going to pose complicated challenges for us and require really tragic sacrifices on the part of the Ukrainians.
So Todd, thank you. And Hal, thank you very much. We're going to go to you, Fritz.
Good morning. My background is sort of the basis for the question I'm going to have for you. And my background is SAIS, and I was very lucky to be there when I was, because I had Louis Holly, who wrote Cold War's history as one of the profs, and then folks like Pierre Hasner and Bob Osgood was my mentor, and they helped shape understandings of the Cold War at the time. And I then went on to teach such, and to the extent that I was effective teaching at a university on this topic, it was always grounding things in history, the national security built on Cold War. And now I'm in academic publishing, working with authors on Cold War and such things. So this leads to the question. I've read a number of your pieces, very good craftsmanship, enjoy it. And so you now missed most of this Cold War. And so you're looking back at it, and you have to pick and choose. And there's possibly some familial influence in your study of the Cold War. But who do you look to? Who do you draw on? Who are the folks that you think have merit their works today? Who would you say to a student, go read such and such from that time to get a better understanding? Because it's clear there are many pieces of that were so time limited that there is no further value. So I'd like to know who has influenced you and who's helped develop you, and who do you rely on and trust as you now relate the Cold War to contemporaries?
Well, it's a long list, and one of the things that I say in the acknowledgments of the book is basically, and I offer thanks to all of those people whose work that I cited, and I offer an apology to all those people whose work I couldn't cite because I was literally up to the word limit that my publisher would let me get away with. But I mean, just to kind of take the flip side of a point that I made earlier, I actually do think it's useful to go back and read works that seem more time limited now, because they remind us that what seems self-evident now didn't always seem self-evident. And so I have my students, for instance, read the Lippmann book every year to get a sense of the tenor of some of the debates during the early Cold War, and to understand why it didn't, containment was not necessarily like a policy that everybody fell in behind and said, yes, logically that makes sense. It was quite the opposite. And so then you can view kind of the remainder of the Cold War as a test of some of the assumptions underpinning Kennan versus those underpinning Lippmann. And so there's a lot of utility in doing that, just as a way of reminding ourselves of how people thought at the time, if only because that reminds us that decisions that were made that didn't turn out well, it's not because the people making them were stupid. It was because, they faced severe pressures of their own that they had to deal with in difficult circumstances. In terms of, kind of retrospective literature that I find quite useful, I guess I would say that there has been the area where we've seen the biggest kind of expansion of our knowledge base in the past 30 years has probably been on folks that are looking at places other than Washington or London for perspective, right? And so there has been really, I think, fundamental improvements in our understanding of Soviet foreign policy and military policy, life behind the Iron Curtain, the role that China played in the Cold War, even to a certain extent, trying to help us piece together what Kim Il-sung was thinking in the 1950s, and so or what Fidel Castro was doing, in Angola in the 1970s, and so that was an area where we had to do a lot more conjecture back, 30 or 40 years ago. And while we don't know as much about those subjects as we do about, say, US policy toward Vietnam, which has been, studied in exhaustive detail, we know a lot more than we used to. And it allows us to make arguments about the Cold War that are rooted in a decent understanding of how it looked from the other side of the hill as well. And so there are a variety of authors I think have been very helpful there. And then I think there are a number of folks who have been useful in kind of trying to put the Cold War in a larger context and making sense of what it all meant. John Gaddis, my mentor, has done this in a handful of books. Arne Westad at Yale has done this most recently in his book, The Cold War, but in a variety of, I think his book on the Cold War in the Third World is one of the best books that's been written about the subject. I have a colleague at SAIS, a guy named Sergei Radchenko, who's basically writing a long history of the Cold War that I think he's pretty close to finishing, and so it should be out in a year or two. Vlad Zubak has written a variety of different things on this. And so if it sounds like I'm filibustering, it's just because the list of people that I've learned from is very, very long. And any time that you're dealing with a period as extended as this one, while I try to rely a lot on my own archival research, you can't help but draw on the work of others.
Very good. Thank you. Your book hasn't arrived. I'm looking forward to it when it does.
So thank you, Fritz. Let's turn now to Howard Sherman. You have the floor.
Yes. Hi. I am an ordinary American voter with an interest in this issue. Do you think that the United States focus on the Russia and Ukraine situation and devotion of resources to that situation creates an opportunity for China to become more aggressive toward Taiwan and possibly other islands in the area? And if so, how likely is that to happen, and what moves are they likely to make? In particular, how likely are they to make further expansionist movements in the South China Sea?
So I think the answer, and this will sound very squishy, is that it depends. And so in so far, I think that the Ukraine war has mostly been bad for Chinese interests from kind of an objective standpoint. It's made everybody around the world more worried about autocratic aggression, and that's going to have implications for what China's neighbors do to prepare for that possibility, just as it's having implications for what Russia's neighbors are doing in Europe. I think it has left the Chinese with a real black eye vis-a-vis Europe in particular. And I think it's entirely possible that one outcome of this conflict in Europe will be essentially turbocharged containment of China, as the United States and a variety of other countries say, okay, we've really got to rush to get ready for the prospect that you mentioned if China tries something similar in the Taiwan Strait. That said, I think there are considerations or potential considerations that cut in the other direction. And so at current levels of resources, and that's an important caveat, there will be a distraction dividend for China. The United States is going to have to devote more attention, more resources to shoring up NATO's eastern flank in the near and medium term. This crisis isn't going to end anytime soon. And so if you assume that there's a finite quantity of stuff that the United States can devote to global security issues, then the amount that we can devote to Indo-Pacific issues is going to suffer a little bit as a result of this. Now, the caveat is that if one of the outcomes of this crisis is that it leads to a significant rewrite of American defense strategy and significant increases in American defense spending, then that trade-off becomes less painful. The second maybe benefit the Chinese might reap from it is it depends on what happens in Ukraine. And so my hunch is that so far, Xi Jinping and the people around him are a little bit taken aback, or should be taken aback, by how much trouble the Russians have had and by how severe the Western financial, economic, and technological response has been. And I'm sure that has some impact on calculations about what might happen if China attacks Taiwan. But again, the caveat here is that we're only 3 weeks into this conflict. And so if 2 months from now, Russia has achieved a lot of its military objectives, if it has forced Ukraine to make peace on disadvantageous terms, and if you've got inflation running very high in the West and people are starting to get tired of the sanctions regime, the lesson that the Chinese might draw is that the democracies actually have no stomach for this sort of confrontation. And so they might impose some temporary pain on us in the case of an assault on Taiwan, but it won't be sort of to a longer lasting decrement to our interests. And so I think a lot of the lessons that Xi Jinping draws from this conflict are sort of yet to be written, and they depend a lot on what happens in Ukraine in the next 6 months to 3 years.
So Hal, I'm going to indulge myself and follow on from what Howard just asked. Are we clear, is the Biden administration clear on our goals and our vision and what winning, let's say maximalist and minimalist objectives, what winning looks like this year, next in Ukraine?
In Ukraine, probably not. I think that we're still very much in avoiding catastrophe mode at the moment, and avoiding catastrophe is an important thing, and so it's entirely appropriate that we are heavily focused on it. I don't know that the Biden administration has a good view of what an acceptable outcome looks like. We have a good view of what a desirable outcome looks like, which is that Ukraine successfully defends itself. The Russians suffer a real bloody nose. Maybe some people in the Russian regime start to wonder whether following Vladimir Putin is the way to success or not. But whether those things are realistic, I think is harder to say. And one of the reasons I think it's the Biden administration probably hasn't quite figured this out yet is that I'm not sure that anybody has figured out what kind of the mutually acceptable equilibrium in Ukraine is. And so the objectives that both sides have stated, in the Ukrainian case, it's the negative objective of not being conquered. There's not a whole lot of overlap between them. I think the Ukrainians have tried to signal that they might be open to some sort of compromise settlement that basically goes back to the status quo prior to the fighting starting. And so maybe they wouldn't quite recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea, but they wouldn't really contest it either. Maybe they would go back to kind of the Minsk II framework for Eastern Ukraine, but there still appears to be a gulf between anything the Ukrainians would accept and anything the Russians would offer. And in part because I think it's also not quite clear whose side time is on in this conflict. I think in the near term, maybe time is on Russia's side, and that they have the majority. They have a preponderance of combat power in Ukraine. They can probably figure out a way of overpowering Ukrainian defenses. But the longer this fight goes on, the more it's going to drain Russian resources, the harder it's going to be for Russians to sustain combat operations, because they've committed such a large portion of their force already and don't seem to have a lot in the way of meaningful strategic reserve at the moment. So the Ukrainians might calculate that if we can keep this thing going for 3-4 months, then time starts to play to our favor. And so there's that question. There's also the larger question of where do we think our relationship with Russia goes after this? And my own very pessimistic view is that we go into a much more protracted, sharper phase of the U.S. Russia competition, and it's hard for me to see how we get to a stable and predictable relationship with Russia anytime soon. But I think that's probably a question that we're all trying to figure out at this point.
So Hal, thank you. It is 12:05 Eastern, you all. We're wrapping up. Larry, I'm going back to you if you have an additional question or comment.
Well, I don't know if he has the time to answer, but values were important during the Cold War. They weren't always consistent, but the normative and, in a way, ideological element mattered. And it looked like it was subsiding. It looked like we were entering a changed global zeitgeist in which the support for democracy and belief in democracy was waning, and Biden was sort of whistling in the wind. But I'm wondering if that's changing now, and to what extent are they still going to matter for whatever new phase of great power competition we're in?
My hunch is that the current war is going to have the effect of really sharpening what I see as the fundamental cleavage in the international system, which is between the mostly, not entirely, but mostly democratic states that really have a lot invested in the current international order, and the mostly autocratic states that are trying to undermine or perhaps overthrow that order. I think that, notwithstanding everything I said about the way in which this cuts in different directions for China, I do think one of the consequences of this will be to push Russia and China closer together in the near term, because neither of them has a particularly good alternative to relying on the other at this point. And we're seeing the emergence of sort of trans-regional coalitions of democracies that are basically saying, we don't want to live in a world in which autocratic states can just knock over countries next door to them. Japan, Taiwan have come into the sanctions coalition, for instance. And so I think there is certainly a prospect of trying to rally broader democratic groupings that cut across regions and are sort of committed to maintaining an international system in which a variety of norms still pertain, whether that's self-determination and non-use of coercion to resolve international disputes, or preservation of a international order in which democratic values can thrive. I think you're going to see a heightened emphasis on that in the coming years. And I think it is quite important. And Larry, I know you would agree with this. And I would just kind of briefly refer people back to Harry Truman's speech in 1947, when he asked for aid to Greece and Turkey. He couches it in a much larger argument about the sort of international system that the United States should seek as a means of protecting itself. And it's very much framed in the language of values, norms, what we might call ideology, because that was important for rallying Americans to cause, but also in a way of expressing what the competition was ultimately about.
So thanks, Larry Diamond. I'm trying my best. Two more on the condition that you can ask or comment in 60 seconds or less. Larry Haas and Jim Robinette, do you sign up to that condition?
I do.
Larry, go.
I do.
Very quickly, Hal, you're the national security advisor to Biden. What are you telling him to do differently? More of this, less of this? What should he do that he's not doing?
So, Larry, thank you. Hal, hold on that. Jim, can we get you in right now? 60 seconds or less, please.
Yeah. I am currently general counsel to the Naming Commission, former Cold War armor officer who patrolled the Iron Curtain. And I just wanted to say that it seems to me that the cannibalization of heavy forces, ground forces in Europe, and the substantial surface warfare forces in the Pacific have both set the conditions for adventurism by Russia and China. And it seems like the Army hasn't really, they've sort of begun to reverse that course. I'm not sure that the Navy has begun to reverse its course. And I wanted to see if you had a comment. Since we're lurching back to realism, it seems like there's a real failure of deterrence that we've seen. And that's based on a lack of capability, military capability.
Both great questions, and I'll apologize for how briefly I'm going to answer them. My advice to Biden would be tear up the national security strategy, tear up the national defense strategy, and start over on a basis of a recognition that parking every other relationship so you can focus on China ain't going to work. And we are an order of magnitude away from the level of urgency that we need, and we're significantly off in the level of resourcing that we need to deal with both of these challenges at once. On the second point, it goes to the first point, which is that the balance of power has eroded severely in Eastern Europe and the Western Pacific over the last 20 years. But it wouldn't take miracles for the United States to have a decent deterrent in coordination with our allies in either places. I mean, I think we would need sort of, a few heavy brigades with some supporting stuff in Eastern Europe to make aggression look unprofitable from the Russian perspective. We just need, sort of more shooters and sensors in the Western Pacific to make an invasion of Taiwan look unprofitable. And so these are things that we can do. It just requires a higher degree of urgency, frankly, than we've seen to date.
So you all, thank you very much. 12:10 Eastern. I have one thing on my mind, and that is student evaluations. And we can't have it that student evaluations at the end of the semester say, Professor Brands, brilliant professor, brilliant lecturer, brilliant mentor, but he comes late to class. That can't be on us. So all of you, terrific questions and comments. Hal, thanks for spending nearly a full hour with us on a terrific first-rate piece of research and writing. Congratulations. Thanks for making time.
Thank you for having me, Jeff, and thanks to everybody for coming out and spending some time with me this morning. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you all. Appreciated.
Thanks so much.